think the recording should be working. Great. So welcome to the first live coding session, you guys. Today we're going to cover using multiple 1D arrays in tandem with each other. How do we get one-dimensional arrays to correspond with each other? And also we'll have a review of for loops. So hopefully this will directly relate to the assignments you guys are going through. And if at any time you have questions, please just let me know. Shout out questions, or especially if it's something that you're not, well, I guess this doesn't really apply to two people, but if ever there's a question you don't want to just say out loud, feel free to send a message to me, either to everyone or directly to me in the chat, and I'll have that open and we'll be happy to answer it along the way. So yeah, interactive sessions generally, I think, go better than ones where I'm just talking at you for an hour. So please, I welcome questions, comments, or just random observations. So multiple one-dimensional arrays. In the easiest context related to what you guys are doing to think about this is probably students versus their grade in the class. So when we're thinking about the type of array you would want to store all the names of students, what's the variable type we'll use for this? Type of variable to store a student's name. Yes, absolutely. And to capitalize it, to make a string array, you just write string with this with the square brackets, and we give it a name. I'll call it students, or student names equals new string array. And let's say we have 5 students here. It can be anything you want, but it'll be, we'll just arbitrarily say it's 5. Next, we need to put in one for the students' grades. What type of array do we want to use? Or what type of array should we use for the student grades array? Yeah, why is double better than int for grades? Yes, exactly. So this will allow us to say, you know, instead of just, let's say we want to round an 89.5 to an A, or something like that. If we use integers, it can't process. It will take an 89.9, lop that decimal position off, and just turn it into an 89. So doubles are great for storing the decimal values as well. So now we have 2 arrays, and I want to populate them. Now we're going to not take a pause from arrays, but it's hard to talk about arrays without talking about for loops as well. I want to populate both of these arrays with values. Let's populate the student names manually, and then we'll add all of the grades automatically. So let's see. So student names 0, and I hope you remember that the index of the first element of any array is 0. We'll call that student Johnny, and just copy that. And let's say so now we have all the different students in our class. All names here in no way correspond to names of real people. Ignore any similarities. If I want to assign them all grades automatically in a for loop, I need a for loop that will let me go through each of these indexes, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because in an array of 5 elements, your indexes are going to be 0 through 4. So how do we begin a for loop? We need to create some kind of integer, and I'll just call that I. I in general for these things stands for index. So if that seems similar, you're right. Um, we'll say as long as I is less than. Let's make this very robust and say say I needs to be less than student names dot length. And then we say I plus plus, or we could say I equals I plus 1. They represent the exact same thing. So if anyone's unsure of what the I plus plus is, it's just saying set I to I plus 1. And I'll write it out long since you guys are just to make sure we have complete clarity here. So I want to take student grades with the index I and set it to some value. Let's say every single one of us has gotten 100. Okay, let's say for this example, we have a class where instead of taking the average of the assignments, we're beginning every student at 100% average. And for everything, every exam or test that they don't pass, we're going to deduct points. So we need to start the average of all of the students at 100. And let's run this and see if it works. It ran, but we're not seeing anything really. Instead, I want to, okay, so this for loop sets the grades. And here we say, set the names of the students. And I'm just going to make another for loop here, and this will print the names and the grades. So here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of today's lesson. Hopefully all of this should be fairly straightforward. We've created 2 arrays. We've set one of them manually. We've hard-coded these values. The other one, we've just set them all to a value of 100. We could instead make this a random number or 0 or just leave it blank for now. But how do we get them to relate to each other? Sure, they're both of length 5, but how do I know that the very first grade in there represents Johnny's grade and the second grade in there represents Maya's grade? Well, if we have an index here, and because I'll be referring to it as an index, I'll just call it, I'll call my variable here index. If we have an index here, imagine that this index represents the student and their grade. Student 0 is Johnny, and grade 0 is Johnny's grade. So there's this association there when we have 2 completely separate arrays, because when we've created this data, we've intentionally made the 2 arrays correspond to each other. Any questions about that at the moment? Okay. And yeah, please, because I think some people have been filing in. If at any point in time there's a question or something seems confusing or I gloss over something too quickly, please stop me and let me know. So I want to print out the names of the students and their grades. So index corresponds to both of them. So let's say I want it in the form let's say I want something to print out in this form, and I just made it a little more complex so we can put multiple strings together. So we have a print statement, and the very first thing we're going to print out to get Johnny is going to be student names 0. And I'm intentionally doing this wrong to illustrate a point. Then we want to print out the apostrophe S, grade is, and a space. So I'll just turn that into a string and also add in, now for 100, that'll correspond to the 100 in student grades. And to finish it off, I need to add a percent symbol. I doesn't exist in this scope, so I is actually index, or you know what, I put in 0 for Johnny's grade, and I want Johnny's grade to be outputted as well. So now let's try to run it and see if we've populated both of our arrays. Sure enough, it is printing Johnny's grade is 100%, although it's a double, so it's giving us that 0.0. But it's printing Johnny's grade every single time. I want to print out Johnny's grade, then Maya's grade, then Joanne's grade, and so on. So we actually need to change this 0 from a fixed, give me the 0 element. Instead, give me element at index, where index is our integer that's starting at 0, and it's continuing to go until you reach 1 less than the length of the student names array. That probably sounded a little complicated. Index, as we go through this for loop, is going to equal 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4. And those numbers correspond to each of the names. So I change it to student names index, and when I run it, sure enough, it gives me all of the different names and their grades. Now, as much as I want to believe that all of us get 100%, this isn't the case. So let's say we're making an app that gives different grades. We need something to deal with just different grades here. I don't want to get into the math.random example, but I can show you another way to run this exact same thing. Math.random would be a way that we can get random numbers. Instead, I'll just manually assign each of the grades. And let's see. Let's say I got a 76. Maya got a 100. Joanne got a 100. Tammy got a 95, and Rich got an 80. Now no one should get mad at me. And I run this, and another problem here. And it's always good to test your code in multiple ways to see this. Every single person's grade is Johnny's grade. That's because I've forgotten to change this index here to index. Instead, I've just set it to a solid value. So instead, I'm switching it over to index again, and I'll run it. And now here we have every single person's grade corresponding with their name. So let's take a step back and think about what's happening here. We have two arrays, one of them of strings and one of them of doubles. They both have the exact same length, 5. And student names corresponds to the names of each of the students, and student grades represents the average that person has in the class. And then it all comes together in this final for loop where we go through and we say, for each element in both of the arrays, print out name and then print out grade. Does that make sense? Just what we've done here so far? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah. So let's add in. Thank you so much. So uh, I'm going. Uh, Someone just joined and is there's audio coming through. If could everyone please mute yourself? Okay, thank you. It went away. Okay, so yeah, excellent question. Let's go ahead and add a scanner in there and do just that. Let's turn these into multiple size arrays or variable size arrays instead. So scanner, I'll call my scanner S equal, oh, and here we go. Of course, I say I want a scanner, and it says, oh, I don't know what a scanner is. Oh, it's not giving me. Or I think it's java.util.scanner. Is that right? Yes. Equals new scanner system.in. And I'm pretty sure that's right. So how do we do that? So first of all, we want to figure out how many names are we being given. So let's go ahead and create well, we'll need to add a prompt first and foremost to let the user know, hey, we're getting some input here. And we'll say something like that. I need this to be a string. So we're going to take this. We're going to have the user give us a number in an integer, and to get an integer, we'll use the scanner next int method. So we'll say int number of equals s dot next int, and try to run that. And just to make sure we've done everything correctly, I'll print out there are please tell us how many students are in your class. Let's say 13. And then we go to the top. There are 13 students. Great. So we're able to store as an integer how many students we have. Now, I'm going to leave most of this the same. I'll copy in number of students to both student names and student grades. And I'll revert back to, let's not worry about the names just yet. Let's go into, no, okay, yeah, it's probably more clear if I redo the whole thing. So I'm going to ask for a new prompt that says, what are the names of all So here we're asking the user to print out a list of different names, and we don't know how long that list is going to be. But we do know ultimately we need to replicate this. How do we replicate this for a variable number of elements? Well, we're going to use the for loop again. Exact same thing we did before. I'll even copy it over so you can know it's exactly the same. The only thing I'll change is student names.length. We don't need that anymore because now it's going to be the same thing, but it's number of students, which is the same thing. That's what it's represented the whole time. And we need to set student names to something. So this is hard coding a single element to a very specific string. I want it to hard code a single element to any string that we're given. So I'll say s dot next s dot next should do it. And let's bring back the print out all the names and grades, because I do want to keep track of what we have so far. Let's say we have 2 students. What are the names of all 2 students? I'll just put in random names. And here we go. So it says the first one, it's corresponding to one of the names I put in, but it's the second name I put in. Weird. We go in and we think, okay, why is that? Well, if you look here, it's only ever setting the first array element. So the first thing it's doing, let me make that more clear. Let me go back to let's say 3. And let's say the names of all 3 students. Johnny, Tammy, and Rich. We have 2 problems here. The very first student should be Johnny, but in fact it's saying the first student is Rich, and the second 2 are null. This is a problem for 2 reasons. It's because of this. We're only ever looking at the first array element, and I'll tell you that first element used to be Johnny. It was Johnny, and then the for loop ran again, and then it was set to Tammy, and then it was set to Rich, and then it all printed out. So to fix this, we change that to I, and that's going to then become 0, 1, and 2, or however many number of students you have minus 1. And it's going to set them to whatever the next string is. So now let's try to write it again, and we say 3, and we'll go again for Johnny, Tammy, and Rich. There we go. And now it's looking accurate in terms of the student names. Does that part make sense? We'll still continue on with this scanner input, but does everything here make sense? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes, I am. No problem. And this will be posted somewhere afterwards that you guys can access it. Any other questions? It could be about this. It could be about just general, like that question just now. Yes, please. Hmm. Okay. Yeah, let me. There's a nice illustration I like to use when it comes to well, it's not just me there. It's a lot of programmers do it. When you think of for loops, I'm just making a blank comment space so we can look at it, and you can think of for loops in terms of the index, and in this case let's look at index and name. So when you're writing a for loop, the first thing you always need to do is create a new integer. This is going to be the thing that counts and says how many times are we going through. The key common difference, and I say common difference because there are many other ways to do it, but for your purposes, the key difference between a for loop and a while loop is for loops are more friendly towards I want to do this number of times. While loops will just keep running until whatever the condition is false. For loops they're easy to run with a fixed size. Don't quote me on that because you can actually use either one for the reverse purpose, but in the context that you're dealing with it, think of for loops as it's going to run this number of times. And what you do here, you create an integer and you say, give me, this is going to be the first number I deal with. It can be anything, and this doesn't need to have any bearing on your code. I could write a for loop that just prints like have a nice day, and I want it to print it out 20 times. And let's say I go less than 20, and I run it, and ignore this. Oh, sorry. I got that error because I was requesting an integer. And here we go. It's running this. Well, actually, it'll run this 20 times. I didn't need to use the index anywhere in that for loop within the curly braces. If you notice here, int I is created, but I didn't actually use it in the line of code that runs. When we're making for loops, the very first thing to do is just create that integer that will kick things off. And I'll bring this back before because this is more useful for us. But it's going to start off at I equals 0. That's a good starting place most of the time. Then your second statement, the second thing within this for loop, is the condition that has to be true in order for the for loop to continue running. Once this conditional statement is false, the for loop will end, and we will leave everything in the curly braces. While that conditional is true, we're going to keep repeating everything in that in the curly braces there. Does just that part make sense? Okay, perfect. And then this is an action that occurs once the curly braces finish. So we get into the for loop. I'm going to run this, and then I get to the end of the curly braces, and I'm going to go back up, but stop. We then have to add 1 to I. So I becomes I plus 1. Then we go through everything in the curly braces again, get back to the top, stop, add 1 to I, and repeat. So what's occurring is I, our index, is starting at 0 and then going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And this is every time the for loop is running. In my previous example, I could say what prints, and it's just have a nice day. And every single time it runs, it's saying that. This is just a visual representation of keeping track of both the index and what's occurring. It's a commonly done thing in for tracing your code and figuring out what happens where. So with my previous example, it would, this would be maybe, this is probably a better mathy way to represent it. Oh, actually, it would only go to index 19. So something like that. It starts at 0, it runs from 0 to 19, and every single time it prints have a nice day. In this example, however, and the only reason the index is progressing from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and so on is because this only moves up by 1. If I wanted to, I could say, I equals I plus 2. And then it would give me 0, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and I would just end up with all the even numbers and 0. If I wanted to have a for loop that goes through all the odd numbers, I would just start it at 1 and then add 2 to the index every single time. And then it would go 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on. So for loops require 3 things within their smooth parentheses. The declaration of an integer, a conditional statement that when it's true, everything in the curly braces will run, and finally, some kind of action some kind of command that will change the index and ideally move it closer to making your conditional statement false. If I just ran this, if I just had it print out, let's go back to the have a nice day example. Everyone take a guess at what you think might happen here. You don't need to say it out loud. If you want to, you can. But let's see. So if I say I want to start off with an integer that equals 1, and as long as 1 is less than 2, and 1 is always less than 2, of course, run what's in the curly braces. And then at the end of running the curly braces, we're just going to set I to itself. What's going to happen? Take a moment to think of it. Does anyone want to shout out their guess? No, go for it. Okay, we have one guess for an infinite loop. Does anyone want to take the stance of it might give us an error? Okay, let's see. And thank you for guessing. I appreciate that. Perfect. Infinite loop. Wonderful. I mean, not wonderful. We generally don't want infinite loops in our code. But you're exactly right. Because I is always going to be less than 2, we just get a loop forever. Let's try it. Can I write the word true here? This takes a conditional. Can I create an infinite loop by just changing the conditionals to something that's always true? Let's try that out. Errors involved. Let's run it anyway. Unresolved compilation problem. Let's see. Unreachable code. So now the compiler is aware that it's never going to move past these parentheses when I have the word true here. So it won't allow that. But when I say this, it thinks, oh, maybe I could be less than 2. But in practice, it never gets there because of this statement. So how does this relate to your work? How does this relate to going through a for loop a certain number of times? The absolute simplest way to deal with for loops is to say I equals 0, usually. I is less than some number, in this case, number of students. And at the end of each loop, I want to add 1 to I. So let's go back to our example and create. But before I move on, do the 3 parts of the for loop within the parentheses make sense? Creating a variable, checking a conditional statement, and then incrementing that index. Is that part clear? Yeah. Yes. S is our scanner. And that's just a regular scanner. No problem. And number of students, if anyone missed it, that was just some arbitrary number that we have the user type in. Any other questions before I move on? Yes, exactly. Yes, fantastic question. This command here, s.next, looks for spaces. It's actually going to break up um, each string by a space. So it's the same as taking in one big long string with a lot of spaces between each name, like a whole list of strings, and running the split command uh, at each space. So I type in Johnny space Tammy space Rich, and it says, "Oh, the first one is Johnny," and I know that space is something we're going to ignore. The next time I run s.next, it's going to take Tammy, and then after that, it's going to take Rich. Um, Excellent question. Does that make sense? Okay. So here, let's go ahead and try to trace our code a bit to get a better picture of what we're looking at. And let's make this easier. So here, I'll just run our code to remind us of what we're doing. I'll say there are 3 students in the class, Johnny, Tammy, and Rich. I could say more students for this and just add more names on here. And actually, it's not just with spaces. I could say Johnny and Tammy are the first 2 names, and it doesn't proceed. It still is waiting for one more. And then I say Rich, and then it goes. So, wow, we've all done very poorly. But we see here Johnny, Tammy, and Rich. The very first index is 0. How do I know that? Because we begin by setting I to 0. And the first name is Johnny. The second name in here, Tammy, and the third one, Rich. So this is, I'll get rid of that too. So this is the for loops process. And once again, we go 0, 1, and 2 because each time we loop around, it adds 1 to the index. So now we have a system that takes in all of the students' names. And we want a system that takes in all the students' names and takes in each of their grades. So what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate this code. And instead say, what? I'll make this a little bit better. This will be fun. Same process. I'm beginning it at index 0, and I'm going through each one incrementally. And I'll say, what is whatever the student's name is, grade. Actually, I'll need an apostrophe S. And this will be how I set students' grades. And I'll say this instead will become s dot next line with a capital L. Oh, got it. Instead, I'll do s dot next double. There we go. So let's see if this works. Still 3 students, names of all 3 students. What is Johnny's grade? I bombed this test. I got a 23. What is Tammy's grade? She teaches the class, so of course 100. What's Rich's grade? He's also very good, but Tammy knows it a little better. And here we go. Now we have a system that takes in different ways. We've gotten the information for one-dimensional arrays. First, we asked all at once, and we said, give me all the students' names at one time before any more prompts happen. Here, we say, what is just this next grade? Next, what is just Tammy's grade? Then what is Rich's grade? But both of them function identically. Both of them have this same for loop here. These 2 lines are identical. And the only difference is I'm prompting in between each value for this. Whereas up here at line 20, I'm saying just give me all the numbers. Now you might ask then, well, Johnny, can I give all the grades at the same time? And let's try that. It's asking, what is Johnny's grade? Maybe I say 23, 195. And what's happening here? Why is it that it doesn't give me any time to answer what is Tammy's grade and what is Rich's grade? Well, that's because it still has stored all of these numbers here, and I'm just running next double, and because it's finding more doubles, it's just going automatically. Let's say we don't want this. Let's say we don't want more things to run as it happens. We can actually clear the scanner before we run it by running next line. And then let's try the exact same thing. But before we overcomplicate this, I'm gonna describe what's happening either way, but I want to add another section in here for grade. So this has been created with two different for loops. We got the names from the first for loop and the grades from the second for loop, but they still correspond. The indexes are the same. Index 0 represents both Johnny and the grade 23. This is how you use multiple one-dimensional arrays in tandem. But now, what was this about the issue here of what is Tammy's grade, what is Rich's grade not being answered? It's a matter of clearing the scanner. And this is something that you'll probably run into in future weeks, so I just want to prepare you a bit. What is Johnny's grade? And once again, I'll try to put in all the grades at once. I'll try to assume I know what's going to happen. It doesn't take it. It still says, okay, whatever that was fine. But now it's asking for Tammy's grade. And I'll give it 100. And Rich's grade I'll give 95. Before we move on, what do we think Johnny's grade is going to be? Because I put in 3 different numbers here. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what it's going to say my grade is? 23, 100, or 95? Any guesses? Yeah, okay. Why are you thinking just 23? Mm-hmm. And when it goes through, it says, what is Johnny's grade? And then it sets it to next double. And next double is going to pull from which number? When I put in all 3 of these. Yeah. And you're exactly right. It maintains that Johnny's grade is 23 and doesn't move on to either of those. Excellent job. Because as soon as we take next double, which is the first number, it moves right back up here and it clears the scanner. It never ever looks at the 100 or the 95 that I wrote for Johnny's grade. I'm seeing we're almost out of time. I want to open the floor to general questions. Hopefully this makes sense of how you can take 2 or as many as you want one-dimensional arrays and have them correspond to each other. The main thing that matters is that when you're setting the values, you're making sure that the index for names is the same as the index for grades for each student. So that way, Johnny corresponds with 23, Tammy corresponds with 100, and so on. And you can expand this out to whatever. I've never at any point in time said it only works for 3 students in my code. That's why we have the number of students variable. So any questions about any of this stuff whatsoever? Yes. Mm-hmm. Ah, that's because in in this program, I wanted to get each student's name first and then ask for each one of their grades. But I like where your head's at. I could actually, and this I hope blows your mind because it's really the coolest thing I can do. I can run it like this. How many students are in the class? 3. What are what are the names of all 3 students? Johnny. Whoa! And it stops me and it says, "What's Johnny's grade?" And I'll say 23. Well, here it's a bit of an issue. It's not looping back around. If I modify it like this, that should work, I think. 3 students, and I should change this. What are the names of all? Okay, who? I'll change this to who is the first student. Um, I'll say that. I'll make it more generic. How many students are in the class? 3. There are 3 students. Type the name of a student. Johnny. What is Johnny's grade? 23. Type the name of a student. Tammy. Tammy's grade? 100. Name of a student? Rich. What is Rich's grade? 95. You're absolutely right. I don't have to do it in multiple for loops. It just depends on how you want the user to see the information. In the first way, the way that has since disappeared, I said, give me all of the students' names, and then I asked for each one of their grades. In this method, I'm saying, give me a name, let me record the name, clear the scanner, then give me that student's grade, and record that grade. Does that make sense? Yeah. So in programming, there's a lot of different ways to do the exact same thing. And with this kind of stuff, it just depends on how you want to prompt the user for stuff, what order you want the information in. Fantastic question. Other stuff, other questions, comments, issues with the code, anything at all. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I only had to use it once each. So in line 16, I'm saying there is an array of strings called student names. And that is going to be a new string array defined by the square brackets, with this many elements in that array. This could just as easily be the number 3. Number of students is only used once per line in both lines 16 and 17. But the reason I have to say number of students here and number of students here is because we're creating 2 separate arrays, and both of them need to have a specific length. And when you're creating arrays, you need to give the number of elements first. It's like uh, egg cartons are always my favorite metaphor for arrays. You have to say, I want an egg carton that can hold 12 eggs at the manufacturer. Or you could say, I want an egg carton that holds 6 eggs. In programming, you could also have an egg carton that holds 7 eggs. But the idea is you need to give the length of the array when you're creating it. So then you create your egg carton with a certain number of containers in it. Does that answer the question? Awesome. No problem. Other questions? Anything at all? All right. I hope the silence means I've answered all your questions and not I've made things so confusing that you have no idea what to ask. But that's time for today. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys have a little more guidance to go on from with your assignment. Good luck, everyone, and I am stopping.